Hi, r.w.forder. The early career of Charles Bradlaugh, 26th of September 1833 to the 30th of January 1891. Charles Bradlaugh was the eldest of 6 children born to Charles Bradlaugh, a solicitor's clerk, and his wife Elizabeth, a former nursemaid. He was born in Hoxton, East London, and was educated at a local elementary day school. At the age of 12, he became an office boy in the company where his father worked. At this time, the family had lived in Bethnal Green, and the young Charles occasionally heard local radical free-thinking speakers in Victoria Park, which was nearby. He also attended the local Anglican Sunday school at St. Peter's Church, where the Reverend John Packer was the incumbent. The Reverend Packer had identified Charles as one of his brightest youngsters and had appointed him a Sunday school teacher. Thus encouraged, the young Charles began an earnest study of the 4 Gospels, but was disquieted by inconsistencies between them. If these writings were guided by God, shouldn't God be consistent? He innocently asked for clarification from Packer and was amazed to receive a hostile response and a 3-month suspension from his role as a Sunday school teacher. Then it got worse. Charles sent Packer a copy of Robert Taylor's The Diegesis for comment, and at the same time announced himself a teetotaler, a free-thinking characteristic in those days. Robert Taylor not only styled himself the Devil's Chaplain, his Diegesis was an extraordinary work of scholarship which mercilessly explored Christian origins and claimed it to be rooted in myth. Packer visited Charles Sr. He gave his son 3 days to change his mind or leave his job and his home. The young Bradlaugh was never one for compromise. He left home and was offered shelter by Eliza Sharples, Richard Carlisle's former partner, and her 3 children. Bradlaugh spent his time at the Carlisles in fruitful study, teaching himself French, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. At the age of 17, he made the acquaintance of Austin Holyoake, G.J. Holyoake's brother. It was he who arranged for George Jacob to take the chair at a meeting where Bradlaugh spoke on the past, present and future of theology on the 16th of October 1850. Bradlaugh had just given his first infidel lecture and shortly afterwards wrote his first pamphlet, A Few Words on the Christian's Creed. Despite these youthful achievements, Bradlaugh was broke, having failed to make a living as an independent coal merchant. Consequently, in December 1850, he took the Queen's shilling, enlisted in the 7th Dragoon Guards, and was posted to Ireland, where the misery he witnessed made a profound impact on him. He didn't enjoy army life. When an aunt agreed to buy him out, he was delighted. On his return, he took a job as a solicitor's clerk and was married to Susanna in June 1855. 3 children followed: Alice, Hypatia, and another Charles. During this period, he was learning much about law and was lecturing increasingly frequently on free thought subjects. At first, marriage and family life went well, but he was to be overcome by tragedy. Susanna drank heavily. She died in 1877, aged just 45. His son Charles had already died, aged 10, and Alice died in 1888, aged 32. Only Hypatia was to outlive her father, dying in 1935, aged 77. In 1858, Bradlaugh was invited to take on the editorship of The Investigator, a militant radical paper. That closed, but he was then invited to take on the editorship of the National Reformer, alongside Joseph Barker. He was to remain editor, apart from a break from 1863 to 1866, until his death. At this time, Bradlaugh was also establishing himself as a platform speaker. Harry Snell, who was to become a Labour MP, and later as Lord Snell led the Labour Party in the Lords, said this: "Bradlaugh was already speaking when I arrived, and I remember as clearly as though it were only yesterday the immediate and compelling impression made upon him by that extraordinary man. I've never been so influenced by a human personality as I was by Charles Bradlaugh. The commanding strength, the massive head, the imposing stature, and the ringing eloquence of the man fascinated me, and I became one of his humblest, most devoted of followers." Tom Mann was a young trade unionist when he first heard Bradlaugh speak. This is what he said: "Charles Bradlaugh was at this period, and I think for fully 15 years, the foremost platform man in Britain. When championing an unpopular cause, it is of advantage to have a powerful physique. Bradlaugh had this. He also had the courage equal to any requirement, a command of language and power of denunciation superior to any other man of his time. He was a thorough-going Republican. Of course, in theological affairs, he was the iconoclast, the breaker of images." So, what did Bradlaugh stand for? First and foremost, he was an atheistic freethinker, i.e., it was his belief that Christianity was used by the established church to repress working class people and keep them in their place. He thought that the surest route to improving the lot of the working class was to make them free. There were many obstacles to that freedom, but religion was at the heart of many. Related to this, he was a fervent advocate of a free press. Bradlaugh was also a Republican who believed that religion underpinned monarchy and the aristocratic structure of society. It's perhaps worth adding that when Victorians talked about republicanism, they were talking about more than just the abolition of monarchy. They were talking about the aristocracy too. Let me quote some of the final words from the impeachment of the House of Brunswick, which was written by her. "I loathe these small German breast-bestarred wanderers whose only merit is their loving hatred of one another. In their own land, they vegetate and wither unnoticed. Here we pay them highly to marry and perpetuate a pauper prince race. If they do nothing, they are good. If they do ill, loyalty gilds the vice until it looks like virtue." Third, Bradlaugh was a Democrat who campaigned for an extension of the vote to include all males. He often referred to the household vote. As such, he didn't believe that the 1867 Reform Act went far enough, as it only enfranchised males who are householders or paying a minimum amount in rent. Fourth, perhaps most surprisingly, he was a constitutionalist who believed the British parliamentary system capable of reform. He was an opponent of violent revolution. Fifthly, lastly, Bradlaugh was a neo-Malthusian, or to use more modern terminology, a birth controller or family planner. Like Carlyle, he believed one of the principal causes of poverty was large families, and he was horrified by the frequency of abortion and infanticide in Britain's towns and cities. For Bradlaugh, it was partly a matter of social and economic improvement, partly a moral crusade. The story of his and Besant's republication of the birth control tract, Fruits of Philosophy, is the subject of another episode. In a previous episode, I mentioned how prolific Annie Besant was. However, not even she could rival Bradlaugh. The Freethought Publishing Company's catalogue for November 1878 lists 10 full-length books, 32 pamphlets, and 5 records of debates in which Bradlaugh participated. You could also purchase framed photographs of the great man. Of course, he was also writing regularly for his National Reformer. Now, I think it's also worth adding, there was one thing Bradlaugh was not, and that was he was not a socialist. In 1884, he debated the question, will socialism benefit the English people, with Henry Hindman of the Democratic Federation, which was a socialist organisation. Bradlaugh began with these words: "We both recognise many evils. He wants a state to remedy them. I want the individual to remedy them." And then he added, "Revolution, as he, Hindman, says, is to be effected by argument if possible." Why? What if argument is not possible? Force! Yes, that's the term. Force! Yes, that is the curse. He then went on to list a number of other objections, including growth in the power of the authority of the state that would be necessary to implement socialist measures, and the dangers of authoritarianism that would arise. On occasions, his writings seem to anticipate Stalin. Bradlaugh also noted that throughout the 19th century there have been experiments with socialist projects, and all of them have failed. At heart, Bradlaugh was a politician who knew he needed a base from which to work. By the early 1860s, he was widely regarded as London's leading radical and secularist. In 1866, he founded the National Secular Society in the midst of increasing agitation for reform. Its principles included, and I quote, that human improvement and happiness cannot be effectually promoted without civil and religious liberty, and that therefore it is the duty of every individual to actively attack all barriers to equal freedom of thought and utterance. Bradlaugh proclaimed himself acting president and was duly confirmed in the role at a national conference. Soon the NSS was spawning local branches. Of course, the whole project was made feasible by the establishment of a national railway network from about 1850, which meant that leading figures in the movement could travel the country. Bradlaugh also needed a headquarters. In 1868, the NSS took out a lease on a property at 142 Old Street and named it the Hall of Science. First, it had a capacity of 700, but this was soon more than doubled with extensions and a gallery whereby it could hold 1,600. Bradlaugh had no trouble filling it. By 1870, there was a large lecture hall built to hold 1,200, a small hall for 220, dressing rooms, school and classrooms, and a coffee and restaurant room. Bradlaugh now had his newspaper, a national headquarters, and a national organisation. Now he turned his attention to Parliament, a story to be related in another episode. Further reading. Well, there are three excellent biographies of Bradlaugh that are reasonably available. The first and oldest is by his daughter, Hypatia, and J.M. Robertson, and was published very soon after his death. The second was written many years later in the 1960s by David Tribe, himself a former NSS president, and it's entitled President Charles Bradlaugh. And the third and most recent is a very lively volume written by Brian Niblett under the excellent title, Dare to Stand Alone. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to contact me about this or any other aspect of secularist and NSS history, my email address is r.w.forder@btinternet.com.